Let's bring in our guest now from Mexico City is John Ackerman. He's a law professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Also in Mexico's capital is the editor of El Heraldo newspaper, Jose Carreno. And joining us from the city of Guadalajara is former government advisor, Rodrigo Aguilar. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. John Ackerman, let me begin with you. Why are candidates being killed in such a way?
Well, because we have a generalized crisis of the rule of law of Mexico for the last 10 years. Mexico has been turned into a bloodbath in general. Ever since the militarized drug war began in 2006, very much imposed by Washington, the United States, and embraced by the last two presidents, Felipe Calderón and Enrique Peña Nieto, Mexico has become a very violent place. And of course, narcos need political protection now more than ever before. And so there's complicity and there is an attack directly on the political sphere so as to assure control over specific geographic areas. It's interesting that most of the violence has been against local politicians.
Right.
National politicians have not been affected yet. And this speaks directly to the issue of geographic control over narco routes.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're looking at all these multiple local offices all over the place. Rodrigo Aguilar, if you're a local politician, what do you have to do or say to not get killed by the narcos?
Well, it's very hard to tell because, as John already said, the whole situation in Mexico in terms of violence against local communities is widespread all across the country. Of course, there are more geographically located zones that are more dangerous than others. But if I were a mayor and I would be in danger, I would probably have to cancel my candidacy or to try to find a protection from the state. But again, it is very hard to tell. It is a risky business to be a local candidate in some areas, especially those who are controlled by the drug dealers. And it's a very risky profession. I mean, so far we've been also having a lot of journalists killing during the last 10 years. We have around 200, 250 journalists. So that is also a profession that is at stake with all this violence.
Yeah. Jose, are they ultimately in control, given that they control life or death? And the fact that as a candidate, you have to either align yourself with the narcos, especially on the local level, or you'll be dead. Does that mean that the narcos control the society?
No, I wouldn't say that. Most of the candidates that have been killed at this point have been killed in very small communities or relatively small communities. There is a very difficult situation. We do not know exactly how much the narcos have gone into the political body of the country, and we do not know exactly how much or how far the killings are only by narcos, because some of the murders have been done more for reasons that have with other groups of delinquency as oil stealers, or by local reasons like in the community problems in Oaxaca. So it is not exactly all narco thing, but there is a lot of it.
Right, but Jose, given that 82 were killed, and when we have the election, there's 3,400 local government seats up for grabs to fill up Congress and the Senate, it adds up, right? These are not high-profile politicians, but it adds up. If you say at least half of those killings even had to do with smuggling routes, at least half of those killings, I'm being conservative here, had to do with the narcos controlling a particular place. Add it all together, doesn't that mean that a large part of the society is being controlled by narcos?
Absolutely. I have no problem accepting that. The problem is nobody knows exactly how far and how large. The problem is, how do you measure it? The problem is, how can you cope with it, and how can the political body control it? It is, it is a menace, it's a threat to society, it's a threat to the political body, it's a threat to democracy, but at the same time, we do not know exactly how far is it, because so far at this point, is relatively located to smuggling routes.
Right.
So that makes a difference.
Right. John Ackerman, is the state unable to or unwilling to put an end to this?
Well, that's a big question because, especially in the context of the elections coming up, as you mentioned, this is one of the biggest elections, perhaps the biggest election in recent Mexican history, with over 3,000 posts up for dispute, a major presidential election. The context is very important because we have this incredible citizen uprising, the peaceful uprising against the sitting government, against the authoritarian system, which is Mexico today, a real struggle for democracy from civil society. Trying to make these elections into a real democratic transition in Mexico, which we have not undergone. Even though people speak of a democratic transition, Mexico continues to be an authoritarian system. And the big question is whether the narcos are already, and may even more, play a role in trying to shut down this citizen hope. And like you mentioned in the introduction, trying to, for instance, reduce citizen participation in the voting. Citizen voting has typically been between 50-60% in the presidential elections. The hope is that in these presidential elections, it could get up to 70%, and that could be good news for democratic transition. But if the narcos play in along with the authoritarian system, and that's not just the local level, that's at the national level, this could be a real risk for democracy this July 1st.
Yeah, interesting that you say that it is an authoritarian system in your opinion. Rodrigo, let me ask you, have these killings dented or damaged Mexican democracy?
Well, of course, in a very deep way since Presidente Calderón took office in 2006. But what I will say that killed more the democracy of my country is the corruption and the level of impunity and the absence of the rule of law. I will say that combination is even worse than the killings of the drug. And I will explain a little bit more. It is unthinkable that in 2018, we are experiencing another campaign of fear. The ghost of the electoral fraud is also a part of the conversation today. So that sort of those sort of elements in this election will turn this election a very historic one and an election as no other. The democracy in Mexico is at peril, of course it is, but I will say that after the election in July 1st, we will be a different country whoever wins the Mexican presidency.
Jose Carreno, is it a part of that corruption that so few people have been arrested or convicted for killing politicians?
I think that both problems feed each other. If you have a group, a narco group, let's say, controlling a region, and they control the local authorities, of course they will have impunity. And that feeds their own sense of power and their own sense of invulnerability. So if you have these regions all over the country, that makes a big amount, and yes, that is a real problem. It is the kind of issue that is turning up the electorate in Mexico. And as Javier is right, it is at this point probably corruption and impunity are the biggest issues in the election, and probably also the largest issues to be debated in the country.
Mm-hmm. John, something that blew my mind while I was doing my reading for this segment, in the state of Guerrero, the Roman Catholic bishop, Salvador Angel Mendoza, held a Good Friday summit with the cartel leaders, begging them not to kill politicians ahead of the election. What does that tell you about Mexican democracy? What does that tell you about where the power lies? And maybe the possible solutions to this, that maybe it doesn't have to do with government. Maybe it takes, I don't know, the church leaders to sort things out.
Well, the first part, definitely, this speaks to a very serious crisis in the institutions and rule of law in Mexico. Of course, the corruption and violence and these assassinations in general are intimately linked. The reason why the government does not investigate these crimes is because many of the investigators themselves, and I insist, not just at the local level, but also at the national level, are implicit one way or another. Cifra negra, the black, how do you say it in English? I'm forgetting English. The number of crimes that are actually reported to the authorities is only 9%. So 91% of crimes are not even reported to the authorities, and of those who are reported, only 2/3 of them are actually investigated. So 94% of crimes in Mexico are not even investigated. And this speaks to, on one hand, the ineptness of the government institutions, but also lack of trust of the people in the authorities. They go to present a crime to the investigators, and often it turns against them. The investigators who are in the pockets of the criminals themselves turn around and start investigating the victims themselves. So we have an institutional crisis. Now, the issue or the idea that the church might be the solution, I think this is absolutely, in this drastic case, this is what's happening in Guerrero. But in general, in Mexico, we've had a very clear, perhaps it's the country which has the most clear separation between church and state since the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1917, the Constitution of 1917. The church has been totally excluded from politics. So we need to find some other way of regenerating society and politics. And these elections on July 1st, I think, are a great opportunity. If Mexico is allowed to have a democratic election, that would lead to stronger institutions, because if the institutions, the new politicians, are indebted to and accountable to the people, really, and not to electoral fraud, as Javier mentioned, is very much a reality today in Mexico. Very frequently in local elections and also federal elections, there is fraud. And the real struggle for July 1st is to have a legitimate election and a president who is actually elected by the people, who can use that legitimacy to impose and establish a rule of law.
Jose Carreno, how free and fair will those elections be?
I think it will be a lot more fairer and freer than what is being suggested. But that is my personal belief. It is the government, the state has made a huge investment in the Instituto Nacional Electoral, and I do not believe that the way that it has been working is it's a fraud is possible. However, somebody mentioned the vote of fear. Somebody mentioned this kind of, let's say, ways to trying to influence the vote of the population, which are not exactly democratic. And yes, I believe that there are trials, attempts to create the vote of fear. However, I do not see. Perhaps I'm too optimistic, but I do not see the possibilities of political fraud in the urns or in the election itself.
Well, I can never have a guest who's too optimistic, so it's good to have you on. Rodrigo Aguilar, let me ask you about the war on drugs. There's a theory that applies to Mexico as well as Colombia as well. It's that with the war on drugs, with the help of Washington, by taking out kingpins, so for example, in Mexico's case, perhaps El Chapo, these gangs splinter and bifurcate, and it almost makes it worse. It's actually much easier to fight the narcos when they're just under one big cartel, and more difficult given that there's a proliferation all over the country. Is that part of the problem?
Well, that was basically the failed strategy that President Calderon did in 2006. That was exactly the reason why the Mexican war on drugs became so badly terrible in terms of violence. But you know what? I think we haven't talked about the sources of what is actually fueling the violence in Mexico.
What is it?
Inequalities, the extreme poverty that we have in Mexico. Of course, the absence of the rule of law. Those are conditions that, for example, anthropologist Carlos Montemayor used to say that if you are a really poor guy in Mexico, you have only three choices. You either migrate to the United States, you start your own business in the informal economy, or you get involved in the drug business. So those are the options that the really poor people have in Mexico. So those are the sources of what is happening right now in Mexico. So we need, of course, to tackle those sources, income inequality, poverty, and so on.
John Ackerman, very finally, do you agree with that? To solve this problem, you have to solve the whole society.
Yes, inequality is one of the major issues. Mexico has, almost, depending on how you measure it, 60 million people below the poverty line. About half of the population is in poverty, and this makes them very vulnerable to the narco traffickers. Just one other note in terms of this campaign of fear mentioned by Jose Carreno. Just yesterday, the candidate from the ruling party, Jose Antonio Meade, released a new television advertisement against principal opposing politician, Lopez Obrador, who is also way ahead in the polls. And this advertisement, 30-second advertisement, you should look it up, as your viewers can find it easily, is an absolutely aggressive portrayal, making up relationships between Lopez Obrador and, burning vehicles, violence in the streets. There's this, very intense effort by the government, because this is the ruling party's candidate, to create this context of fear and violence so that people do not go out in the polls. So once again, this is the big question. Are these narcos really willing to, play the game of the authoritarian government, or are they willing to stand aside, at least at the federal level, for these elections? That's going to be something to watch running up towards July 1st.
Okay, fascinating. I've learned a lot, gentlemen. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. John Ackerman, Jose Carreno, and Rodrigo
Thank you.
Aguilar.